Hello and welcome along to the industry analysis for the strategic case study of November 2019. Here we're going to be looking at the real-world courier industry, broadly speaking, and hopefully we'll be able to shed light on some of the potential issues and scenarios that could come up on exam day. Before we get into the industry analysis, I want to address a question that students often ask when it comes to the industry analysis lessons, and that is, what is the purpose of an industry analysis when, after all, we're given detail about the industry within the pre-seen document itself? Isn't it overkill to do a separate, in-depth industry analysis? Well, let me just say right off the bat, first of all, that you are certainly not expected to be an industry expert by any stretch of the imagination. CIMA does not expect you to know all the ins and outs of how the real-world industry works. However, I do think that there are two very important reasons why you should do a little bit more research on the real-world industry than what you're simply presented with in the pre-seen document itself. And those two reasons are as follows. First of all, it does help you to anticipate some of the potential issues that might come up in the unseen scenario on exam day and thereby avoid any nasty surprises or confusion. If you're well versed in the real world industry and you're very familiar with all the ideas and concepts that apply and operate within the industry, then you're going to be better placed both to deal with those kinds of concepts and ideas as they arise in the unseen, but also be able to anticipate some of the kind of realistic scenarios that might occur and that will be part of framing the problems that you have to solve on exam day. Another reason I think it's important to do an extra bit of work on the industry in terms of extra research, apart from the pre-seen document data that you're given, is because it makes it easier then to illustrate and apply your abstract theoretical knowledge from your objective studies on exam day by using, for example, concrete examples or illustrations from the broader industry. If you're, again, familiar with those concepts and ideas that tend to operate and apply in the real-world industry, you will be able to use them more efficiently on exam day, and it'll be easier for you to explain yourself in terms of the pre-seen company and in terms of the broader business environment. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into the industry analysis itself. Before we do so, let me just give you a quick rundown or preview of what it is we'll be covering. We're going to start with a very broad industry overview, looking at some key figures and quantitative analysis in section 1. In section 2, then, we're going to move into some of the specifics of the industry. We're going to be focusing in on industry trends and important facts and figures that shed light on some of the more particular trends and developments within the industry in recent years and indeed for the coming years as well. And then in section 3, we're going to focus in particular on some companies, the major companies, 3 indeed major players within this industry, all of which could be said could compare with the pre-seen company of Runn Couriers. And so that's a good reason to look at these real-world examples and consider what might be learned from them. At the end, we also have included some of the sources, the key sources that we have relied on in forming this industry analysis, and you can dip into them at your own leisure if you wish to do so, or if you want to go a little bit into more detail on any of the particular issues raised herein. Okay, so let's get stuck into section 1, which is the industry overview. So I want to start with just a brief history of this industry. The package delivery industry has changed dramatically over the years. The earliest known private express company was Wells Fargo, which was founded all the way back in 1852. During that time, the industry was unregulated, of course, very common for things to be unregulated that far back, and packages were delivered manually from door to door. However, with the passage of time, the industry has adapted technologically, of course, and it now makes use of sophisticated equipment and networks, as you were given clues to in the pre-seen document, to ensure fast and timely delivery. Globalization, of course, is a huge factor as well, and the growth in e-commerce, especially in recent years, are among various economies across the globe. This has helped to shape a highly competitive courier service industry that we are familiar with today. Let's look at some of the types of service providers which fall within this broader category of the courier industry. Carriers, first of all, are large delivery companies that have a wide delivery network and a large fleet. Their fleet includes airplanes, trucks, vans, and even ships. Carriers offer an entire supply chain solution for a large variety of goods. Companies such as FedEx and United Parcel Services, or UPS, are good examples of modern carriers. Freight forwarders then are often subcontractors to things like airlines or carrier companies. Most freight forwarders offer specialized services like pallets, parcels, or bulky goods transport. And then finally, we have haulage services, which are exclusively focused on transporting bulky or heavy goods. Haulage services are not trackable in the same way as services of carriers or freight forwarders. Most haulers make use of rail networks like CSX, Norfolk Southern, for example, and Union Pacific Corporation in the United States to transport their goods. So you can see here there's also another way of breaking down the types of courier services in terms of the time it takes for them to be delivered. You have standard courier services, overnight services, same-day express courier, international courier, and then you have pallet courier services as well. And we're going to explain each of these terms now. The standard courier services generally involve collecting the parcels, sorting the parcels, and transferring the parcels to the closest depot to the delivery location. The parcel is then loaded on a van and delivered to the desired destination. So this is perhaps the most protracted form within the courier industry of delivery. This service typically then, of course, takes a few days, and it is generally the cheapest of all the courier services, of course, because it places the least demands on the courier company. Overnight service is the same as standard service, I should say, but slightly more expensive, and the parcel is guaranteed to be delivered by the next day. And of course, correspondingly, you're likely to be charged a higher price for those kinds of overnight services. Same-day express couriers now are becoming increasingly common as the demands of consumers are becoming more stringent and more urgent, is the most expensive of all the courier services and used for deliveries that are of an urgent nature. Then, of course, you have international courier services that's used for the transfer of goods overseas. Typically, of course, one would be expecting them to take a number of days. The price varies, of course, greatly depending on the size of the package, the speed required, and of course as well you're going to have to take into account the distances. International could be next door neighbour country, or it could be all the way across the world, and so of course they're going to factor into pricing decisions as well. Pallet courier services then are used for the delivery of goods on pallets. This is generally for bulk deliveries. This service offers strict delivery schedules at affordable rates. So the idea here is that because they're transporting things in bulk, they will tend to group together these kinds of pallet deliveries, possibly from other companies, in order to make it affordable and scalable. And so that's one of the reasons why they tend to do that. And of course, that allows them then as well to offer more affordable rates than if they were to do individual pallets in one delivery. Other types of courier services, well, you can look at it from a business type point of view. For example, you can talk about business to business couriers and business to consumer couriers. And in most cases of the largest courier companies, similar to the one that we're dealing with in the pre-scene, they tend to deliver to both. They deal with both business to business courier services and business to consumer services as well. You can also break it down, of course, by destination, I should say. You are going to have, of course, more domestic courier services, and especially, for example, within urban areas and cities. And then you also have the international players. And again, as indicated with the business type breakdown, the major players like DHL, UPS, as we'll see, tend to serve both domestic and international as well. This is indeed an industry that lends itself quite well to economies of scale. Then you also have a breakdown by end users. So, for example, you have the services industries are served by the couriers. That would include things like BFSI, banking, financial services, and insurance. You then have wholesale and retail trade, of course, which relies heavily on logistics, delivery to the final consumer. And that now includes, of course, e-commerce as well. Manufacturing, construction, and utilities, another one of these industries that is very, very dependent on effective and timely delivery. When you think about replacement parts, construction parts for the timely construction and delivery of buildings, offices, houses, and so on and so forth, of course, they're going to be very, very demanding in terms of timeliness. And then you have primary industries like agriculture and other natural resources. But I think certainly the middle two there in terms of timeliness and getting things delivered in a good condition and on time, wholesale and retail in particular, and manufacturing, construction and utilities, so much of their reputation will depend upon timely, effective and safe delivery of the goods in question. Let's have a quick look here at the volume of international parcels dispatched. And this gives you a good indication of the sense in which this industry is kind of speeding up and accelerating in recent years. You can see here, just based on the trajectory, and if you draw the line over this growth trajectory, it seems to be accelerating. There is moving towards what looks more like an exponential growth from year to year rather than linear. You can see here in 2017, 176.13 million units dispatched across the world. 2011-2017 then, this is a very healthy growth trajectory indeed. So let's focus now on some more specifics of the industry and really key trends and facts that should be borne in mind. We'll just start with a kind of an overview of international delivery. First of all, there's kind of two different ways that international parcels and packages are delivered in the modern context. So private carriers like FedEx and UPS handle package delivery from the sender in the US, for example, all the way to the recipient in the destination country. The US Postal Service handles package delivery up to customs at the destination country, at which point the host postal service of the destination country handles package delivery to the recipient. So we're talking here about the National Postal Service. In the case of the US, is still the US Postal Service. And they tend to liaise with the corresponding or equivalent, as close to equivalent postal service in the destination country. And so there is a kind of a potential for discontinuity there, and maybe even for potential confusions and so on and so forth. Whereas companies like FedEx and UPS, one of their many competitive advantages is the fact that they tend to have distribution networks set up in many, many countries all over the world. And so there's a seamless interchange between the host country or the delivering country and the destination country. So as you can see here, this is just a graphic overview of that relationship. For example, with FedEx and UPS, two very similar companies in the sense that they are very global distribution networks, very global courier companies. And so when it comes to going to other countries, in most cases, virtually all cases, they serve nearly all countries throughout the world, they have a network already established in the destination country. And so there's a very seamless changeover, coordination and so on. Whereas when it comes to the more traditional parcel delivery organizations, which were up until at least very recently, for the most part, were either government owned or with monopoly privileges, or indeed with significant government stakes, controlling stakes in those companies, you have a little bit more discontinuity because there's a requirement of coordination between those organizations from different countries with perhaps different internal policies and different operating cultures. So that's something to bear in mind there. That is indeed a big competitive advantage for these companies like UPS and FedEx. So the global CEP industry is majorly driven by the growth in international trade, unsurprisingly, but I think more so than any other industry, this is one that is just really, really driven by the broader economic context and situation. It's really sensitive to that in a way that perhaps some other industries are not. Some other industries, you're always going to have the same or comparable levels of demand for certain things. Whereas when it comes to this kind of global courier industry, international trade and liberalisation and the maintenance of trade between countries is a huge, huge factor and a really important precondition of success. So growing due to the liberalisation of trade, of course, conditions through various, free trade agreements. These are increasingly important for these kinds of companies. Several countries are establishing special economic zones, or SEZs, free trade zones, FTZs, and export processing zones, EPZs, which provide the transportation industry with efficient infrastructure, connectivity to ports, export facilities, and, crucially, economies of scale. The emergence of new trade corridors is also helping logistics and transportation companies to improve their profit margins. To capitalise on these opportunities, several small CEP, that is Courier, Express and Parcel, and logistics companies are entering into collaborations with bigger market vendors. This is expected to then boost the global CEP market size in coming years. Particularly, we're seeing this liberalisation of trade and the openness to more international trade in recent years in the APAC region, that is the Asia Pacific region in particular. That's where we're seeing major moves, especially in places like China and India. Just bear in mind here, just a terminological point, sometimes this causes confusion for people. Logistics and courier industry, sometimes people wonder, are those interchangeable terms or are they used in distinct ways? For your own purposes, I think it's safe to use those two terms more or less interchangeably. The key difference really is that logistics tends to be used in an internal sense. That is to say that you talk about the logistics within a particular company. So a company it's the way in which a company manages the movement and flow of goods and the different parts within their own supply chain, whereas the courier service really refers to the entire network of deliveries amongst various companies and to various kinds of consumers. But I think for the most part, that is a fairly pedantic distinction for the purposes of talking about this industry. So don't worry too much if you say logistics industry at one point and courier at another. Courier is technically the correct term, but of course logistics plays a huge part in this industry especially. So it is very, very important, of course, to have very strong logistics because that is the core competence of a courier company. So here's a nice little visual overview and some key figures to bear in mind of the global industry. You're seeing here projected compound annual growth rates from 2018 to 2024, very healthy indeed, 8 to 10%, and it's going to be quite the jump in revenues for this particular market. The base year is 2018, going forward to 2024. As you can see, Asia Pacific is the fastest growing market in this area, both currently and indeed is projected to continue to be so for the next 5 to 6 years. And currently the largest market in absolute terms is still North America, perhaps unsurprisingly. Key players here you can see at the bottom, very familiar logos, as you I'm sure will agree. DHL, FedEx, UPS in particular have really great global brand recognition and brand awareness. And of course it's going to be very hard for smaller companies to dislodge those big three. But it is nevertheless, as we'll see, a quite competitive industry. The global courier, express and parcel market is expected to reach, as we just saw, more than $400 billion by 2024, 8 to 10% compound annual growth rate during the forecast period. From the past decade, the courier, express and parcel industry has been witnessing very high growth rates across the world. E-commerce is a major growth driver for the CEP market, generating significant revenues for the industry. The rise in e-commerce business in recent years is increasing the business opportunities for shipping goods as well. And the CEP industry is posting impressive growth in developing countries driven by the growth in international trade, and that in particular is applicable, as I said, in the APAC region. Rising internet and smartphone penetration, which is in turn boosting e-commerce sales. A rising middle class population, especially again across those developing nations, and indeed disposable incomes as well, corresponding and correlating with improved standards of living. All of this is very favourable and conducive to growth in the CEP industry. Besides e-commerce as well, there's also emerging trends of omni-channel retailing. What is omni-channel retailing? Well, essentially omni-channel retailing is basically the combination of more traditional retail channels and methods, for example, that is to say physical sales in stores, with various kinds of technological means of reaching customers. That includes, of course, online sales, but also it includes things like using the Internet of Things and devices in store, where you can combine an in-store experience with online orders as well, perhaps for collection at a later point, delivery to your home, and so on. So these, again, omni-channel approaches are, again, improving the industry, strengthening the CEP industry by giving it a new role. So the lack of proper infrastructure and technology is leading to inefficiency is one, of course, the factors that hinders the growth of the market. So infrastructure, that is to say, from the perspective of local government investment in infrastructure. So while we do see an opening up of certain markets, for example, places like China and India, they may well still lag behind in terms of their own infrastructure, for example, the quality of roads, connectivity amongst cities, and so on and so forth. If that really isn't there, then even the major big companies like DHL and so on cannot really penetrate those markets to the same extent, or at least as much as they could. So it is good to bear in mind here that good relationships with local governments, especially in emerging economies, can be very important in the sense that you want them to be investing consistently in the infrastructure of the company, and you don't want to see a government coming along that's going to be cutting back on its investment in infrastructure, especially in those economies that are manifesting strong economic growth, or at least strong potential for economic growth. The last mile delivery, this is mentioned in the preceding document, is a crucial piece of logistics, and final mile delivery costs represent almost half of the supply chain costs. Remember, in the preceding document, you're told that, of course, when it comes to that final mile or last mile delivery, all sorts of issues can arise, which can lead to waste, lost time, lost fuel, higher fuel costs, and so on and so forth. Because, of course, if the person isn't there to take the order, take the delivery, this can lead to waste, it can lead to confusion, it can lead to lost packages, and so on and so forth. So that is where the vast majority of supply chain costs reside. Owing to this, and to accommodate the growing demand to meet consumer expectations, CEP companies are integrating the last mile delivery into the existing services. A lot of transformation is taking place in the last mile delivery, with companies looking at alternatives such as delivery lockers, pickup points, again, remember they were mentioned in the pre-scene, crowdsourced deliveries, drone deliveries, and indeed even autonomous vehicles. Autonomous vehicles, of course, is perhaps a little bit far off just yet when it comes to actually getting out there on the roads. It's probably more of a medium-term consideration, but it is something just to keep in mind. You might see as well some of these major companies like DHL, UPS, and so on taking the lead when it comes to investment in R&D, or at least lending a hand to research and development, or partnering with some of the autonomous vehicle researchers and companies out there that are trying to develop these in a way that's practical, implementable, and safe. So when it comes to delivery, that could seriously revolutionize the industry. Think of all of the labor implications as well, of course, all of the structural shifts that could entail. But again, as I said, more than likely, we're talking more medium to long term in that respect when it comes to actually getting on the road, when rubber meets the road. But at the same time, there may well be issues about investment in those kinds of research programs in the shorter term. The evolution of a technology is reshaping the entire supply chain and reinventing the parcel industry. Technology is becoming a crucial enabler in increasing efficiency and reaching or meeting consumer expectations. Market concentration. This is something to consider. Is it a concentrated market or is it not a concentrated market? It has to be said, despite the big three recognizable brands that we mentioned earlier, it is a highly competitive industry nonetheless. A large number of national postal operators still are in operation. Global integrators as well play a significant role, and other smaller privately owned CEP companies that serve more local and domestic regions and are specialized and tailored very specifically to the needs and to the unique circumstances of local markets. They're also putting pressure on even these bigger players. The market is fragmented, it's therefore with intense competition. So you can see in this chart on the left, this bar, which represents more and less consolidated, the CEP market is actually placing quite low there towards the fragmented, I should say, end of that particular scale. As the demand for CEP service is growing rapidly in developing countries, the companies are becoming more competitive in order to capture this huge opportunity. And of course, the big players are obviously trying to corner those kinds of markets as soon as they can, but that does not mean that they necessarily are going to have success, because one of the advantages, of course, of these local or national companies, and indeed of the recently, for example, privatised public postal and parcel services, is that they already have an established infrastructure, or at least they have a much better knowledge often of the existing infrastructure within the country. They also might have a better understanding of how work operates there, the working culture, expectations, and so on and so forth, better connections. So that is something to consider. DHL, UPS and others do not necessarily have a winning formula as a foregone conclusion. They certainly will have to anticipate some of these challenges from local players. The international players are making strategic investments, of course, to establish regional logistics networks. So that investment in logistics in those target countries, and indeed in the infrastructure in those countries, is very, very important, such as in the opening of new distribution centres, smart warehouses, and so on and so forth. So they do have that capital clout to invest in very advanced depots and so on in those target markets. But they do still have to think about these local companies. They are facing high competition with the multinational companies that do have a comparatively well-developed infrastructure, or at least a blueprint for an infrastructure. That's something to bear in mind. These companies like DHL, UPS, what they can do often is they can use their infrastructural templates and blueprints that have already been a success in their established markets, and then simply transplant that and tweak and modify it as is necessary to the target market. So as a number of startups are entering the market leveraging digital technologies, there is a trend of large companies acquiring these startups to gain significant footprint in the market. So acquisitions, both as a strategy to achieve growth, but also as a strategy perhaps to preempt or prevent potential competitors, is something we do see happening increasingly frequently, especially when we're looking at those developing markets. So DHL and others, those are two key ways in which they can head off the threat from potential local competitors. Firstly, by reproducing their successful distribution blueprint from other existing markets and trying to apply it with appropriate modifications in the target market. And secondly, looking to see what startups are already there, what logistics networks or companies are already serving the local markets, and see if it's possible to acquire them ahead of the actual entrance into the market. Let's have a look now at the North American market, which of course is such a crucial market in the CEP area, as we saw in terms of in absolute terms, still is the highest value market in the world, and so for that reason it is worth considering for a moment. The CEP market comprises of companies that provide logistics and postal services, varying in the types of services offered, such as delivery speed, weight, volume of a shipment, and so on. By 2020, the North American CEP market revenue is estimated to be around 60 billion euros and is expected to increase at a compound annual growth rate of 5% between the period of 2015 to 2025. Recall the global compound annual growth rate was projected to be between 8 and 10% in a comparable period of time. So that is unsurprising, of course, because the North American market, after all, is going to be a very mature market, and so you can expect to see lower growth rates over the next 5 to 10 years when compared to the global context, which then is the CEG or compound annual growth rate in that context is obviously ramped up because of the fast growth that we're seeing in the emerging economies and the very large emerging economies of, for example, China, India, and so on. The US courier and parcel delivery services industry consists of about 7,500 companies, so really is quite fragmented when you think about it. That's just in the United States alone. So despite perhaps the illusion of highly concentrated or even an oligopolistic market, just because of the brand recognition of companies like DHL, UPS, and so on, despite that, you still actually do have a huge amount of competition even within that one market. And of course, that does reflect the fact that often these smaller companies that are serving or hyper specialized on particular communities, particular cities, particular towns, and so on, they are actually quite tough to compete with because they will often have very close relationships with both the end consumers or their customers, whether it's corporate customers or consumers at the other end. It doesn't really matter, but they're really more likely to have very strong, close personalized and customized relationships. They're likely to be a little bit more flexible, for example, in the terms that they can offer to local customers, whereas these larger companies, while they benefit from economies of scale, they're likely to be a little bit less flexible, perhaps a little bit less understanding, likely to give a little bit less leeway to customers, and so on and so forth. So that is something to consider. Is there a way of kind of finding that happy middle ground between being a huge company with great economies of scale on the one hand, and then having a personalised touch on the other hand? The industry has seen steady growth in the last few years. A major chunk of the industry is held by its two key players, as we saw earlier, FedEx and the United Parcel Services, or UPS. Looking here then at the global market situation in terms of growth rates, this is a nice, interesting little colour chart, and this kind of simplifies things quite well. We're looking at growth rate by region projected for 2019 to 2024. And as we saw, green is the high growth regions, and that is the Asia Pacific region, as we saw, unsurprisingly. Then you have the mid growth regions, that is the European and American markets, and the low growth regions, perhaps again unsurprisingly, we're looking at Sub-Saharan Africa and South America. The economies there are still many issues that have to be overcome before they can reach the degree of international integration and trade activity that some of these other more developed nations have. So that is the situation just from a simple colour-coded perspective.